Keynote lecture will be given by Professor Laurie Zoloth. And Laurie is from Northwestern University and in Illinois. And over the past many years, we scientists always talk about the good things or what we are interested. But actually, we should also look at other areas, what other people think, especially the public. And most people are concerned about the ethics issue of the synthetic biology. So I think everyone would like to hear what the other people, and especially on the ethics area, what people think about synthetic biology. So it's always good to hear something from the good side and from the bad side. So Professor Laurie Zoloth.
Okay. I want to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's always great to start a conference on science with someone who teaches philosophy, right? So that's my job here. I also wanted to say it's wonderful to be back in China. The first time I was in the Shanghai region was 1972. So think about that for a minute. It was a very different world. I was 22, I was a young student, and had been invited because the American student movement was very supportive of the Chinese Revolution. So it's always a pleasure to come back and see the extraordinary changes and the extraordinary developments, especially in science. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk today about bioethics, and I'm going to talk today about not only a broad overview of bioethics, I'm going to try to talk to you about two critical issues that have to be developed along with the elegant science that's being developed here in this country and around the world. Science itself, doesn't quite fit, right? Science itself is widely understood as the most magnificent achievement of humankind, the achievement that has brought humankind out of areas of tremendous suffering and tremendous brokenness. And yet, people agree that, in fact, even though science needs to be supported and has extraordinary capacities, it needs to be regulated and needs to be reflected upon. It's critical, as Harold Shapiro, head of one of the America's Bioethics National Commissions, pointed out, it's critical not only to be in awe of science, but to understand both its promises and its limitations. So what I'm going to do now is to walk you through my talk. First, I'm going to make the claim that how we talk about science does matter. I'm going to talk about the basic challenges that confront us now in all basic research, in all emerging research, not just synthetic biology. I'm going to talk about why this has led to two very different stories or narratives about synthetic biology. And then I'm going to give you two cases, historical cases about synthetic chemistry, and try to explain how these historical cases lead us to a deeper understanding of our present situation. And then I'm going to try to convince you that there's two basic virtues that all scientists need to have as they go forward in their careers. So, the story we tell about science is often one of enormous progress. We tell a story, you've just heard a beautiful story, of increasing progress, increasing strength, and increasing mastery of the natural world. And that is based on our ideas about what it means to be a modern person. In modernity, we don't think that we're subject to fate. We think that we have the capacity to control things, and we relish the capacity for control. We also believe that things are getting better every year, right? I see the cranes everywhere, more buildings, more progress. We have an incredible optimism in modernity. We don't think of time as cyclical, we think of it as progressive. And finally, we love being provided with new and better objects. And that part of what we like about our objects is the sense that every time an object is created, a better one will come along. Hence the iPhone, for instance. Everyone lines up and gets new ones. And we have that kind of idea not only about objects, but about science itself. On the other hand, we know, if you have done any real science at all, that science isn't endlessly progressive or endlessly successful. Science is based on accident. It's based on surprises. And finally, it's based on failure, learning from failure. Now, the public doesn't understand this, but every scientist understands how much failure is a key method of all of science. And that's why we call it experiments, right? That's why we call it lab experiments and not narrative fiction. It isn't true as a scientific claim unless it could be falsified, unless, in fact, other experiments fail to disprove it. It's unlikely that these realities and these fragilities of science are ever discussed widely. Most of the time, we hear stories about the benefits of science and the progress of science. We don't hear stories about the fragility of science and its capacity to go wrong. And in fact, that is inevitable in science. And if everything was perfect, it wouldn't be science, it would be some other project. Science is about failure. Now, so there's a disagreement, there's a tension, two things happening at once, a contradiction, between the story of science and the actual pragmatic reality of science. Now, this is made much more vivid in the present period because of three critical factors. And this is true for all of science. It's just as true for physics as it is for synthetic biology. Science is sold to funders in a new way. There's an increasing desperation as we approach significant planetary boundaries that makes getting it right ever more important. And finally, there is significant and rising opposition to any projects of science that's gained political credibility, especially in Europe and in the United States. I'm going to look at each of these in turn. First of all, funding. Now, funding for science is increasingly competitive and increasingly fragile. Funding is increasingly privatized, whereas in the United States, most of the funding used to be done by the National Institutes of Health, the National Academies of Science, the National Science Foundation. Now, increasingly large public foundations, privately owned, and the result of donations, are funding science. Now, that means that there's a different structure in how funders have to be convinced to give their money to you. The science needs to find people with some self-interested reason to support their idea and thus fund it, and their optimism is critical to the entrepreneurial spirit. So in stem cell biology, for instance, people had to find patient groups to fund essential projects. In genomic and genetic research, often patient groups or family members or wealthy people with a significant disease take on specific projects. And their interest, not what's scientifically most important, but the interest of the funders then drives the project. And that's a change in how science is funded. And secondly, cutbacks in funding have occurred in the United States since 2008 as Congress increasingly keeps looking for the best bang for their buck, wants to see transitional goals, wants to see specific and measurable outcome, and outcome studies and translational medicine begins to drive public funding, and that means funding for basic research has been substantially cut back. Now, the second major problem that's confronting science and that shapes our ethical understanding of synthetic biology is we are facing serious and unprecedented threats. And the good news is that finally, in the last few weeks, countries, governments, and leaders, China's leaders, United States leaders, have signed historic pacts because they've understood the unprecedented necessity to confront these threats with government action. Human beings face planetary-wide threats at a level that's never before been experienced. 2014 is going to be on record. It's on track for being the warmest year ever recorded in human history over the last 10,000 years. In Nature, in September of 2009, just before the Copenhagen Climate Summit, an article by Johan Rockström and colleagues tried to describe a safer operating space for humanity and said that, in fact, these planetary boundaries, barrier limits, global warming, species extinction, nitrogen blooms, epidemic diseases, and hunger were, in fact, problems that needed to be solved and would likely only be solved with a combination of personal behavior changes, governmental action, and most importantly and critically for this audience, scientific advances. Now, the premise of all funding and the premise of how we attack problems has always been around justice. Public funding is public because it's based on foundational premises about fair play, good rules, and public funding and public oversight. The trouble with having privately funded projects or projects driven by individual needs or entrepreneurial needs is that it's not inherently the case that oversight is going to be available in those privately funded arenas. Now, as we enter the Anthropocene, we're in a different historical time. And this quote from the article in Nature really describes the dire state that human beings faces. We face irreversible changes leading to states less conducive to all human development. Now, the broken boundaries include some of the targets that synthetic biologists really are going after. Biodiversity loss, chemical pollution of water and soil, atmospheric aerosol loading, climate change, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, global fresh water, and changes in land use. And these are all areas that if any one of these completely falls out of sequence, it is a species-ending event. And by 2014, several years after that initial article, these 4 boundaries have already been crossed, seriously threatened. And this last month, November 1st, the UN IPCC issued a final report saying that human influence on the climate system alone is clear and growing, with impacts observed on all continents. If left unchecked, climate change increased severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. The gathering risk of climate change is so profound they could stall or even reverse generations of progress against poverty and hunger. So, facing an absolute crisis, the need and the cry for science couldn't be stronger. And yet, just at the moment you would think that people would be turning to people in synthetic biology and in physics saying, figure this out, instead people are opposing science. Now this is complicated because despite the increasing threats, there is a strong population who fiercely opposes new technology, and this opposition to GMOs, for instance, has led to serious policy changes that have been quite robust. Policy in how African countries can't get grain for famine is a component of the fact that EU that won't allow GMO grain to be sold in Europe, which means that African countries can't grow it, which means they can't take the seeds from American companies. You see how this all works out. It's not based in ignorance. I want to be clear about this. It's based in clear ideological and religious oppositions that have some merit. And it's based in very real stories of significant error and destruction because of scientific advance. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion, BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the Japanese nuclear disasters, these all contain serious legacies of both deceit and of faithlessness, because in each of these cases, after the event occurred, there was a virtual abandonment in Chernobyl of the Russian population most deeply affected. And it's that history of faithlessness that really inspires much of the concern about current science. And finally, the single most promising, in my lifetime, most hyped field of new scientific inquiry, human embryonic stem cell research, was marked consistently by several cases of flat-out fraud. So people have good reasons to worry and have concerns about science. And in May 2012, a coalition, so-called a broad coalition of civil society groups, social movements, local and indigenous communities, wrote an oppositional report that was widely circulated opposing synthetic biology. They claimed that there should be a moratorium on every single release or commercial use, public or private use of synthetic biology, and they wanted these 7 principles to be upheld. And notice they're not outlandish principles, but the question is, how exactly would they be enacted? It was left vague. The idea was there'd be a new international, a nation-state power that would oversee and enforce these principles. Now, on the back page, the opposition was made even clearer. On the back page, this group claimed that synthetic biology was only about making monies, and the companies wanted to take over the forests and land in the global south to make so-called biofuels for planes and boats of the military. Using synthetic biology, they would, in fact, make a world ever more unjust and create what they called a food dictatorship wrought by the first kind of genetic engineering. So notice the opposition went from 7 fairly reasonable demands to, on the back page, a flat-out anti-science call. Now, this means we have 2 very competing worldviews, 2 very strong different moral claims. The first by scientists is go ahead. Science and resulting technology is not only good, it's imperative in this very dangerous time we live in. That science has logical solutions and ought to be optimistic, it's properly optimistic. And meanwhile, ordinary people just do not understand scientific expertise. This line of inquiry leads to people trying to teach people more about science, not really understanding that there's fundamental opposition to it. And the opponents say, wait a minute, science is dangerous, has been proven dangerous, science has been proven to be hyped, and ordinary people are excluded from the process of science, and that's not fair. So we don't even agree on core ethical questions when we talk about science. What is the good act? What makes it so? The core ethical question of science. Who will benefit and who risks harm from your work? What should even count as valuable truth? What kind of people are the bearers of truth? And are they scientists? Or are they popular leadership? What is the relationship between expertise and authority? And what's the difference between expertise and authority? What sort of social world is implied by the technology? And do you want to live in that social world? And what's the proper goal of medicine or science? Is the process of creating the technology transparent, rational, and fair? It would be good if we could agree on these essential questions of ethics, but fundamental disagreement, not scientific misunderstanding, is the hallmark of this debate. Now, synthetic biology inherits all the earlier opposition to GM foods. That's just true, and there really is very little you can do about it. Beginning with recombinant DNA and extending to reproductive technology and stem cell research, and the effects of continual opposition for years after years is also cumulative. And by merging 4 disciplines, engineering, biology, chemistry, and genomics, it creates reasons for new concerns even within those disciplines. Synthetic biology excites classic anxieties about technology that have held at least since World War I and World War II, when technology first was used as weapons of war. DNA is, the way people speak about DNA is often when people speak about the soul. Maybe manipulating DNA will somehow disturb one's inner self. The claim is made that nature is normative. Nature is good. Nature shouldn't be manipulated in any way. The claim is made that suffering and morality is the main thing that defines our humanity, so interfering with suffering might make us in some ways less human. The claim is made that dual use for science and use for warfare, is inevitable. And all these 10 issues, all these 10 claims about science have been made consistently at least since 1920, when the first articles about the fears of science begin to appear, and this idea that the world could be made inauthentic and unwelcoming, unheimlich, is a consistent problem when humanists, philosophers, religious thinkers confront science. The tension is that it is finity and contingency that define humanity, not control, and that mastery is a fundamental mistake. Now, if you look at those concerns, you can see that in some way they're fundamentally religious concerns. They're about who you are as a being, not the particular science. And that's why explaining the science in more detail with ever more excitement and fervor never gets to the core of these concerns. There are logical ethical questions in understanding synthetic biology, as I said. We could ask what the appropriate methods would be. We could ask if there's any inherently moral objections in creating or redesigning life. We could have a discussion about why that might be. We could ask questions about synthetic biology. What does it pose with regards to distributive justice? If your projects are successful, will they be fairly distributed? We could ask about the risks that might arise, and we could say if the risks are inevitable, ought they be taken, and under what circumstances? We could interpret contested concepts important to normative thinking about synthetic biology, like life or risk or public interest or health or dignity. And we could ask them about the moral grounds for any specific regulation of synthetic biology research and applications. These questions here were the ones that the society's conferences have had. And over the last decade, we've spent a lot of time working out answers in my field of moral philosophy about these questions. And we've focused a lot on regulation. But the trouble is, focusing on regulation misses essential questions, as I said, more essential concerns. There is long-standing cultural traditions. Think of Pandora's box, think about Icarus, whether it is morally permissible to make new organisms either ex nihilo or de novo. There's been a deep mistrust about the character of scientists, not just science, but of scientists themselves, and of expertise, and even of inductive reasoning. Even the process of inductive reasoning can appear to be creating a discipline that has no founding grounding principles. And people are concerned because there's frequent consequences of science and technology have been used as weapons of war. So my basic premise is this. We need to address the basic and existential concerns and not just the regulatory concerns. First, we have to address the concern that scientists aren't honest. And secondly, we have to address the concern that scientists do not take responsibility for their errors or mistakes or the tragic uses of their research. I think these two problems underlie most of the opposition to synthetic biology. So first claim, you must always tell the truth. There's no way around this. And, okay, this seems really obvious, but people don't seem to understand this. The temptation to lie seems to be overwhelming in science, but data can never be cleaned up, right? Failures really need to be discussed, and they need to be published. Labs have to create cultures of truth-telling even when it's embarrassing or you feel foolish. Science cannot be truthy. It has to be falsifiable, and that's the difference. A really good result, by the way, even a lot of really good results, is not a revolution, and is not redemption, and you should avoid the use of those words. Samples of ways to start, should you need specific samples, things like, biology turns out to be messy, stochastic, and hard to control. A cell is not a circuit board, turns out, right? Or the things we make in the lab do not act like they do in the actual world. Or what we're doing at a small scale may be dangerous and harder to manage at a practical and useful scale. We get a lot of data we don't really understand, and it's really tempting to clean it up. Or just simply, we failed to make that work. Right? Useful phrases, right? Better if they were spelled right. But there is a relationship between honesty and access to power. And what I mean by this is society's trust in science, basically subversive activities, means we allow and we pay you to undermine our basic ideas and our basic traditions. If you live outside the law, you must be honest, said Bob Dylan, and I agree with that. We have to trust that researchers are honest. If we allow you to be subversive, if we allow you to say, don't believe in the givenness, overturn the theories of the past, then we have to trust that when you do it, you're honest. You're telling us the truth about your work. Hopefully you're careful and sane as well. You have a right to free speech and a right to research, and that right draws its power and authority only from the duty to do what Sidney Brenner said are the two fundamental issues in science. You must tell the truth, and you must stand up for all humanity. Now, second claim, standing up for all humanity, what does that mean? I think it means fidelity, and fidelity is critical in science. That means faithfulness, loyalty, consistency, true-heartedness, trustworthiness, dependability, and reliability have to be part of the culture of science. Now I want to look back to explain why I think fidelity and faithfulness to populations is so important, giving you two historical examples about science and consequences. So first we have Humphrey Davy. Humphrey Davy, who's a poet. Here he is at age 29 at the height of his success. To bring the lightning from the clouds and make it subservient to our experiments, one of the most important chemists in British history, and is someone who has done enormous amounts of work in chemistry and anesthesiology. But I want to talk to him about one reason. He wanted to do something good for the public. He was a poor boy. His father died when he was young. He grew up in Cornwall, pretty poor part of England, southern England, ran around in the mines, and became an extraordinary apprentice and scientist in Penzance, and apprenticed and learned how to do science, and then was brought into enormous public prominence because he gave a prestigious post to the Royal Academy of Science. But in northern England, in mine after mine after mine, miners were falling prey to horrible explosions. And there was an enormous accident in the northern region of Northumberland where 92 miners were killed in one day because they wore on their hats, their little hats, a candle, an open flame candle. And that's how coal was mined, by men wearing a candle on their hats and going into the mine. And they would, of course, the methane would explode and there'd be these tremendous explosions. It was not possible to mine coal except on the surface because of the problem of methane gas. And after the latest accident, a safety commission, now look who came to Davies, the Duke of Northumberland, the Bishop of Durham, and every single leading vicar, business leader, and scholar of the region formed a committee and put out a call for a solution. This, my friends, was a roadmap. This was a roadmap that emerged from the needs of the poor, the needs of the people who are working in the mines. And they came to him and they said, of all the men of science, you're the one who could best bring his extensive stores of chemical knowledge to a practical bearing. After he did it, he developed what's called the Davy's lamp. The Davy's lamp became widely used. He'd saved thousands of lives. And he was praised by the British Royal Academy for stopping what he was doing in chemistry and turning his attention to the needs of the poor. Your discoveries exalt the reputation of the Royal Society throughout the scientific world, etc. And, you know, look at the words, look at the way people spoke about science when it was trusted by the public. Davy then goes back to the mines. He goes back to the mines underground, and he spends hours and hours, it was quite dangerous, underground teaching safety techniques to the miners, to the men who had written him and asked him to help. And the results of these labels will, I trust, be useful to the cause of science, but a much higher motive is offered when that knowledge is felt to be practical power, and when that power may be applied to lessen the miseries or increase the comforts of our fellow creatures. Look at the inclusion in his language. Look at the way this scientist understood his duty to the people who he served. Now, urged to take out a patent, he refused, made not a penny on this idea, citing the need for the lamp to be widely distributed, and it was distributed. Variants of the Davy's lamp were distributed wherever people went into mines, and continued until those modern versions were done. Second story is about Fritz Haber. Consider Fritz Haber. In 1918, Sir William Crookes, the future president of Britain's Royal Society, warned of a terrible famine that was coming. And the world was facing the same kind of boundary issues that I argued in my previous slides we face today. And what was the issue? Why was England and all civilized nations in deadly peril of not having enough to eat? Because there was no longer nitrogen. Nitrogen, or naturally occurring nitrogen, was found in bird guano. It was dug up in northern Chile, and it was shipped from Chile to the farmers around the world. And at a certain point, humans had used up all the deposited guano and all the nitrogen. So he wrote this book, The Wheat Problem, based on remarks made in the presidential address. This was the specter of famine. And Fritz Haber answers the call. Fritz Haber is a young scientist, a young chemist, raised in Prussia to the town's most prominent Jewish family. He got all firsts in his military exams, but he's turned down. He can't be a soldier because he was a Jew, and Jews were excluded from military service. So he changed his religion, became Lutheran, and he gets into the University of Berlin, gets a job in Zurich, and he becomes thoroughly German. He is fascinated by this challenge, and he and his best friend Einstein, Albert Einstein, talk about the challenge. Germany doesn't have any access to that Chilean nitrogen, so he has to buy all of it. It's an extraordinary disadvantage for German farmers. And so he gets the idea to turn nitrogen into ammonium gas to fix it and make it usable for fertilizer. And in 1900, he's wildly successful. The Haber-Bosch process revolutionizes food production and is said to have saved the lives of millions. A huge city-side plant is built in Germany. It changes how synthetic chemistry is done. The claim it saves 2 billion lives a year. It was just made in the last 2.5 years ago. Dye makers become extinct, and they're very angry at him. But chlorine is created as a byproduct, and grain yields increase exponentially. 50% of all the world's food production is done using nitrogen from this process. The rats were very happy, and I.G. Farben became a city for chemistry, and he won the Nobel Prize for this effort. Now, these were two wonderful ideas, based in human need and answering science in the best possible way. Davy's lamp saved thousands and thousands of lives, but Davy's lamp was the intervention that made it possible to create the coal mines that are now causing us so many problems with fossil fuel, right? So two consequences. Haber's nitrogen saved lives, billions of lives, but created a terrible problem of the nitrogen waste that Chris Voigt is going to address tomorrow as one of the central problems and the central ideas of synthetic biology. Notice the link from nitrogen all the way back to Haber. And not to mention the use of the excess chlorine made in that process as a gas weapon in World War I. So notice that you can't have a clean sense of good in any scientific effort. It always carries with it the necessity to attend to the consequences of your acts. Now, when we think about this, it's a good example for why risk-benefit doesn't work. First is because risk is unknowable. Secondly, the people who benefit are not the same as the people at risk. Thirdly, because anonymity and collectivity of decision-making makes it very hard to identify the people who should be responsible. And also because we name certain endpoints as risky or unsafe based on what we value and what we can bear to lose. But that depends on which people you're talking about, or if you're talking about market share or talking about polar bears. So notice why risk-benefit analysis won't give you the solution you want, and why the precautionary principle doesn't work either. We can't determine the future because the future is fundamentally unknowable, especially in your field of synthetic biology, which begins with an acknowledgement of the brokenness of the world and not its predictability. We are creatures that are possessed of a plight, which is we cannot not act. History is not linear in the Hegelian sense. So we have to act, and we'll have to act in one way or the other, and the consequences are fundamentally unknowable. And since the consequences of science really are fundamentally unknowable, all we can count on is veracity and fidelity. Because we can't determine all the risks in advance, all we can count on is for you to tell us honestly what you know and what you don't, and to promise to stand by us, the populations upon whom you research, the world in general, and bear the consequences of your mistakes. All science is a moral gesture, every single act. And all discovery has consequences. And in fact, for people who oppose science, that has consequences too. Acting has consequences, and not acting has not consequences, because we are creatures who are possessed of a plight who cannot not act. And what's needed in that kind of situation is the courage to face that future as active moral agents, taking responsibility whatever the result. If you're happy with one and want to make money from your products, that's great, but you also have to stand by your failures equally. Nature is fundamentally unfinished, says synthetic biology. Darwin was right. Nature needs to be destabilized by moral activity. All intervention is a kind of violence, so all calls to nature are arbitrary and historical. Synthetic biology is a kind of deconstructed narrative of being itself. An open reading is the point of science in its fundamental uncertainty. The claim of synthetic biology is both that nature needs to be disrupted and in some sense is broken and needs to be finished, but that there is no knowledge that it's forbidden. For Greeks, knowing was making things, but for Americans, and I suspect for Chinese as well, knowing is unmaking, taking things apart. And that is both interesting to us, but makes us uneasy about the world being possibly unraveled as well as desacralized. Now, laws in this situation are always going to be inadequate because most laws are limited to clinical research subjects. These are the classic laws for DNA research, and you can see here that they all talk about the individual subject, not the world as a whole. So we need to ask the ontological questions. The scientists have to learn always to tell the truth, yes, really, as I said, and they have to learn about failure, and they have to faithfully stand with the mess they make. People in the public and humanists like me have to understand the future is fundamentally unknowable and have to learn to always tell the truth about our fears as well. What we need then, I think, are not rules but moral philosophy, of course. We need to think more. We need to think more clearly. We need to think more substantially. We need to think about who we wish to be. Rights and duties are correlative. So your right to do politically supported science is based on your duty of beneficence, that you're seeking to make the world better, as did Davy and Haber. And this becomes even more important because of two other things. One is the enormity of the need we face, and two is the historical relationship between synthetic chemists and engineers who made synthetic nitrogen in the first place. On some important level, it was your genius as scientific members of the scientific community that got humanity into the Anthropocene in the first place. Therefore, we need you to help us get it out. We need to ask, what does this work make of me, both the opposing public and the scientists? Will I stand behind my words and take responsibility for the world that I have argued? For the scientists, you have to ask, will I be willing to take as blame as I would be to take credit? So the duties of scientists, there are three. One, synthetic biology is heir to the success and consequences of synthetic chemistry and therefore bears the burden and the duty of repair. Two, there has to be honesty about this complex history and honesty about the risks and benefits of new science and the reality of failure and error. And three, fidelity and loyalty to the populations who will be affected by the researchers' success and failure. And of course, the usual things I always say, just be good. Don't break actual laws. Don't abuse graduate students. These things I say to everyone, but these things are important for today. Never, ever lie. And accept responsibility for consequences. Stand by your work and stand by it with fidelity. So, I want to thank you to Cold Spring Harbor, Asia, and thank you to our Chinese hosts and to all these many people who helped me think through this idea. Thank you.
Thank you, because we're too much over time, so I'm not sure if you had question. If you had question, we would allow one. So maybe I have a short question.
Yes.
So far, you mentioned about the plant, this anti-GO. I know that many people are anti-GO, but so far synthetic biology seems to be okay. Not much resistance from the public. What was the reason for that?
The opposition came in the form of that project and that leaflet, that pamphlet that was promoted by the same groups, the exact same groups that opposed GM foods, also opposed synthetic biology. So it's the first. It was just the first thing in 2012, but the opposition is there. I think as the necessity for serious biology changes, I think that's part of the reason that people are less wary about it. But I also think that there hasn't been anything real to oppose yet. So I think when you are more successful, there'll be more questions, and that's probably as it should be.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Thank you very much, Laura.